Kyle, thanks so much. That was a really great group of startups. This is the kind of thing that makes me think that this sector is really going places when you hear from organizations like that. Alex, like any response from you? Like, were there one or two that like particularly caught your eye there?
Well, I'm
Before
friends
you
with
dive in, Alex, just to say quickly, like if the people in the audience have questions for Alex or myself, I am keeping an eye on the Q&A box, so send them over. Sorry,
yeah,
Alex.
no, please. I was just saying I'm friends with a number of these companies. I think I've met with at least 3 of them personally. So I wish them all the best of luck. One of the folks had mentioned the kind of the need for scale up from going from from pounds to tons, to millions of tons per annum to gigatons, and I think that was really the right perspective of thinking through any of these technologies. Doing a pilot is okay, and given that even the biggest pilots right now are 1 million tons per annum, it's nothing, right? We need to get to a billion tons. So the perspective from the start is about how to scale, how to use manufacturing, I think is absolutely right. And I like what Opus was talking about as an example about using proven technology. All the pieces that they're talking about, I think they're right on. I think the question is, can they scale in the timeframes not needed?
Yeah. So one thing that I thought was interesting is a number of the startups talking about the role that carbon credits might play in their business models. Some of them said they could be sort of additional, like this is going to work anyway, and if we get income from credit payments, great. And others said, no, this is integral to the model. It doesn't really work unless we have corporations paying to offset via our processes. And I'm interested in that. Like, how, as an investor, like how do you see those things? If you see a company coming along and saying, actually, we really need carbon credits to make this work, is that something that you would be cautious about getting involved in? Are you seeing these technologies as having to compete with incumbents without any additional help from a credits market?
So certainly any VC is not going to be really particularly interested in a company that only can survive on carbon credits. The carbon credits need to be the cream on the cake. So I think we acknowledge that if carbon credits are very necessary in these early stages to help some of these companies get off the ground on the pilot side. But the challenge with carbon credits is that you can only use them once you've got your company on the ground and you're at scale. So where we would like to see more money as well is into this early stage research to be able to get more companies in the funnel. It's amazing of the just $1 billion that's gone into carbon capture and utilization just over the last about 10 years. So with just 1 billion, I think about 70% has gone to like 7 or 8 companies, right? So I think there's only been about 30, 40 companies that managed to raise any money. So we need to get this industry going to get hundreds of companies that are doing these different solutions. And I think then we have a much better chance of reaching that rather than worrying about the carbon credits at the end of the funnel when they're running the technologies.
So we had a question from Amrit Jalan it's kind of a continuation of my question about the offset. So you say, yes, offsets are useful for getting companies off the ground. But Amrit is asking, beyond that, what do you look for? When you're prospecting CCU companies, what are the kind of 2 or 3 key things that you're looking for in a prospective investment?
So we are looking for something that's fundamentally different that will allow either very large scale and quick deployments using existing infrastructure, or a fundamental change in what they're doing to allow a breakthrough in the costs, right? Those are from the technology side. So one example on carbon capture, if someone had an ability to take direct air capture to, let's say, call it even the $20 to $40 per ton range, that would be super exciting, because what that also means is that if you can do direct air capture at $20 to $40, then you can probably do flue gas capture at a couple of dollars, right? Because it's the amount of CO2 in flue gas is many times that of an atmosphere. So a company that can just get things down that far using direct air capture, even if they're just pursuing that, could really impact the rest of the industry. So that's very exciting. And then also bulk methods to be able to do some of these chemicals. So yes, as one of the speakers talked about, you can take hydrogen and to combine it with CO2 and clean power and all of that. Not everyone has the kind of the cheap geothermal energy for those types of pilots. So how do we make that accessible around the world so any country can develop its own renewable fuels at a cost lower than the existing fuels?
Great. And I'm intrigued by the fact you're saying you're cautious on infrastructure. You don't want these companies to have to rely on significant infrastructure creation in order to make them work. And that makes total sense to me. But I'm also, some of the visions that I find exciting as an analyst and not as an investor do involve the creation of the thing like Oxy's doing, is creating what they call a kind of carbon campus or a green campus, which marries direct air capture with enhanced oil recovery and utilization all on one site. It's a significant infrastructure investment. We've got other stuff coming out, some of the state governments who are looking to create networks of CO2 pipelines so you can capture CO2 from heavy industry and send it either to a sequestration project, to an EOR project, or maybe to a utilization hub somewhere. So there are visions out there for significant infrastructure investment, but you're cautious about relying on them.
Yeah. So any technology that can utilize existing infrastructure is just going to move so much quickly. Specifically, let's look at Europe and the US. Getting right of way in the US right now is not easy. You have to condemn someone's land in order to do that under something called eminent domain. There are requests to get eminent domain lines for CO2 pipelines. Now, we talked about the public uproar. We can mention a number of cases where people are putting oil and gas pipelines through people's lands, and we've seen how that's worked out. That's basically the same thing with CO2 pipelines. So being able to use existing infrastructure, so as an example, being able to take natural gas pipelines out of service and convert those into CO2 pipelines, or even better into hydrogen pipelines. That's a better way because you're not building out that infrastructure. And Europe has the same issue about building out new infrastructure. Also, just in terms of cost, if we can find technologies that can reuse existing infrastructure, then they can focus on reducing the main cost, like the CO2 capture cost and everything else, and worry about that aspect rather than trying to get money for other infrastructure.
Okay, so let's go to one more. So we have a question from Adok Belukar, and he's asking, what seems different in the newer generation of clean tech companies in CCUS compared to clean tech 1.0?
Oh, goodness. I don't think there were any real CCUS companies at Clean Tech 1.0. I think that was mostly, I remember seeing fuel cell companies and a lot of solar companies that went bust. I think one of the big differences we're seeing right now is there was a big focus, I don't know if it was Clean Tech 1.0 or 2.0, I think we're in 3 now, is that there was a lot of focus on biological, so biofuels, and we're not seeing that right now. It seems it's CO2 into traditional areas such as steel, cement, normal fuels. We're not seeing, let's say, CO2 as much into algae, into biofuels in that route, and that certainly I think has changed. I still think that's a very interesting place to be, especially around CO2. To algae and to protein, because protein, as we know, especially from meat and cows, is a big creator of methane. We need to get off the protein economy, as we talked about circular economy before. If we can take CO2, use that to replace different types of protein, that would have a huge circular economy and system impact.
Yeah. And one more from, this is probably the last one because we're pretty much out of time, but it's a great question. Peter Chargin is asking, what's the time horizon that investors have in these kind of technologies? Because a typical VC timeframe may not be practical here.
Yes. So if you look at who's investing into these, things like Bill Gates, Oxy, Shell, the Oil and Gas Climate Network, they all are investing as corporate investors, and they have a long timeline. The few venture institutional investors, they understand that these technologies from, let's call it seed or series A to an exit, let's say an exit based on profitability, have typically been 15, 20-year timelines. And so investors need to be cognizant of those timelines because you still always need to build a capital infrastructure around that. You need to do the tests, you need to run these plants, and then you need to build the next size. And then there's typically at least 4 or 5 iterations of size until you get to what's a global scale plant that you can get that cost down, because no one's going to give you the $5 billion for your second or third iteration. So these things take time, and which is why when we talk to investors, it's like you can't wait and think you're going to get into CCUS, in 5 or 10 years, because of the cycle of testing, especially when you look at safety and everything else, is a long time. So any company that wants to begin doing this, they need to be piloting, testing, investing in R&D right now with the knowledge of the time scales and the capital it's going to take to get to billions of tons of removal.
Great, thanks so much, Alex. Really interesting to get those insights, and thanks to everyone who weighed in with questions. Alex, do you just want to, before we sign off, do you want to give your email again so people could follow up if they have questions?
Yes, well, it's Alex at Climate Impact Capital. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm the only Alex Rosenfeld that deals with climate. So looking forward to anyone's questions and to follow up individually.
Great, thanks, Alex. And I am jg@greenbiz.com if you want to follow up with anything. And Payal, do you want to say a few remarks before we wrap up, or are you ready to turn off the video?
Yeah, again, just thank you so much for your time, Alex and Jim. It's great to see, so many people, staying for this extra Q&A time. I guess, thanks for sharing your contact info. I'm sure many of the audience members will want to get in touch with you. We'll send a follow-up email to all registrants, which will also have your email addresses. So anyone in the audience, if for some reason you didn't get a chance to write down their contact info, we'll be sending an email in the next day or so. And so thank you again for your time, and have a good evening.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.